think Howard is just trying to raise the bar in different ways. I have to start out by apologizing to Dr. Kalın. I've had the privilege of doing political landscape every year that we've had a conference. And every year I say we've gotten to the worst place we could possibly get in U.S.-Turkey relations. We only have one direction to go. I'm not going to say that this year because I feel like we're going to be jinxing things. And General Jones has already started us on the positive side of thinking about Tiger Woods and kind of the making the possible impossible possible. So in the spirit of friendship, sitting in a room that has been a long time coming, in a place that we've all wanted to be as friends of Turkey for a long time, to be able to actually get back to business, to talk about what unites the U.S.-Turkey relationship as opposed to dividing us, we have the unenviable task about talking about politics and kind of setting the landscape that we've heard. So let me start right off the bat with a question that everyone in Washington has on their mind. The defense minister just raised it, the S-400s. He didn't mention directly, but it's equally important in the U.S. context, the F-35s that are being linked directly. And we saw something last week that was extraordinary in Washington, a bipartisan consensus in a New York Times op-ed where the ranking member and the chairman of the Armed Services and the Foreign Relations basically said Turkey has to make a choice. It's the S-400s or F-35, putting the alliance in the balance. How do we respond to that? How do you think about that coming from Ankara?
Thank you, Joshua. Thanks for the invitation and to the ATC for organizing this wonderful event. And I hope it will produce results that will contribute to the positive agenda that we all want to have between Turkey and the United States. Let me answer your question about S-400 and F-35 issue. That needs to be seen within the context of the U.S.-Turkish relations, but also within the context of Turkey's own national security needs and interests. The S-400 decision did not come about just overnight. It has a history. Those who know the technical details, in fact, will remember that for the last 10 years almost, we've been trying to buy a missile defense system from the United States, that is the Patriots. But unfortunately, the package that we were presented never met actually our conditions. That whole process that led to the purchase of S-400, in fact, has been conducted very transparently. There was an open bid to which American companies also applied, but also the Russian, French, French-Italian consortium, as well as the Chinese. And I don't want to bother you with all the details of what happened there, but we have really tried very hard to buy a Patriot missile defense system for Turkey. Our president has said recently that in fact we are prepared to purchase a defense system from the United States, a NATO ally, NATO member. Again, but that has to meet the conditions that we have for our defense system. In regards to attempts to introduce sanctions against Turkey within the CAATSA, I understand we're all familiar with the debate here in Washington, but let me just say very quickly that it will be counterproductive. Rather than using language of threat and sanctions against Turkey, I think our people here at the Congress as well as in the administration should understand Turkey's security concerns and address those concerns in a wider context of geopolitical developments. This relates not only to the missile defense system, but also what's happening in Syria, in Iraq, in our joint fight against terrorism, our cooperation in many other areas, from energy to trade, global issues, regional issues, the Palestinian conflict, Africa, and many other issues. This kind of sanctions language or regime will certainly put a dent to that relationship, which we do not want, because we're working very closely on many other issues. Jim mentioned both, Jeffrey and Jones mentioned our joint work in Syria, where we are helping not only with the Astana process, but also we are part of the Geneva process. We are keeping things under control in Idlib. We are working with our allies in Syria in the fight against Daesh. In fact, Turkey has been the only country that has fought against Daesh with ground forces among all the allies. We've been part of the anti-Daesh coalition, eliminated more than 3,000 Daesh terrorists in Syria, and we've done that all within the framework of Syria's territorial integrity and political unity. As far as the ultimate goals in the Syrian conflict are concerned, in fact, we are on the same page. There are some differences as to who you work with in Syria and how you achieve some of those goals, but the overall overarching goals are the same. The President Trump has also put a new target for U.S.-Turkey trade relations, and he said we should achieve $75 billion trade goal. Now, of course, it's achievable, I believe. It is doable, but we need mechanisms in place to do that. And of course, we need people like business people here and others to make a contribution to that. But how are we going to achieve that goal? If you keep talking about sanctions, language of threat against Turkey. Again, let me just come back to your question and clarify this point. Our engagement with Russia is not aimed at any other third country. Russia is an important neighbor in our region, an important player in numerous regional issues. In fact, our sea neighbor. We have strong trade relations with Russia as well as with a number of other countries, neighboring Turkey. But we are a member of NATO, and we value our strategic partnership with the United States as well as with other NATO members. We still conduct almost half of our trade with the European Union, and we are deeply engaged in a number of defense industry-related projects with our NATO allies. United States obviously being probably the first among all this. So given this larger framework of relations, I think it's important to remember that excluding Turkey, for example, from the F-35 program will not be a punishment for Turkey, but will hurt the entire project. In the long run, it will put American interests at risk as well. Because as we work on all of these issues, I think we have to be very honest in our conversations about these issues. Turkey wants to have good relationship with the United States, but that relationship has to be based on common values, shared interests, and common objectives. And we have to obviously take care of our own national security and our defense system. Remember, when the Syrian war began, in the middle of the most intense period in the fighting, when we were threatened by the Syrian regime, Daesh, PKK, and other terrorist networks, the Obama administration pulled out the Patriots from Turkey on the excuse that they need to be repaired, etc. They never came back. The Germans pulled out after that. They never came back. The only Patriot system we have in Turkey now is the Italian-Spanish one, and we are grateful to our friends in Italy and Spain for standing with Turkey on that issue. But you have to understand this, how this S-400 decision was made against this background. So we have to keep that in mind when we talk about the issue of S-400, F-35. Let me just again repeat very quickly that this is not intended to be against any other third country. We try to follow a 360-degree foreign policy where we want to have good relations with the European Union, with the United States, the Transatlantic Alliance, as well as with Russia, with China, and other countries in our part of the world.
So picking up right there where you left off, we're sitting in Washington where I think some of the distinguished guests already mentioned 2 weeks ago we celebrated the 70th anniversary of NATO that was actually signed here in Washington. The world looks very different 70 years from that point. It seems like what some of us have called the liberal international order that kind of undergirded both the post-World War II, but even post-Cold War environment is changing. And we see that it's not just Turkey, it's many places around the world that are dealing with these disruptions. How do you put that context of U.S. Turkey security relations that have had a special place, as you've talked about, in the context of changes in which domestic politics are having larger impact than we've ever seen before? We've just seen local elections in Turkey that have been very changing. A lot of people in Washington took note. There's some irregularities, things that make Turkey look very different. And in the U.S., we've had a new Congress that's come in, which makes things even more difficult to do. How do you put the global kind of security relations of U.S. Turkey in the context of NATO with these changing dynamics on the ground, and how do you balance those things?
It's in the interest of both countries, Turkey and the United States, as well as NATO, to have a relationship based on mutual interests and common values. I think we have common objectives on all the regional and global issues. One thing that you rightly point out about the influence of domestic politics on foreign policy is that it's something perhaps unavoidable, but I think it takes statesmanship to not let domestic political dynamics have an influence on long-term geopolitical objectives and interests. Turkey is a vibrant democracy. We just had our local elections, and we will not have elections over the next 4.5 years. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to build more on U.S.-Turkish relations economically, politically, and other areas. The two presidents, our president, President Erdogan and President Trump, have developed a good relationship, a good chemistry. They speak on the phone quite often. They met a number of times. And I think we need to capitalize on that personal relationship to address the issues. But we cannot just leave everything to the two presidents, obviously. We have to do our work at our level, at all levels, government officials, business people, advisors, think tank people, media people, and others to put U.S.-Turkish relations on track again so that it will be a mutually beneficial rather than a mutually exclusive type of relationship. Given the global changes in the world, it is true that a new world order is being kind of sought, hasn't emerged yet. We are still looking for it. We don't know what the dynamics will be, but we know who the key players are and what the key responsibilities are. And I think Turkey and the United States should play a role there together to bring peace and stability primarily to the region, but also in terms of establishing a new power equilibrium where nobody feels left out, nobody feels threatened existentially, and everybody feels like they're part of the global order where they can have ownership of the process. That's why our president has been raising the issue of global justice and calling for a reform of the UN Security Council, specifically about the UN system in general, and that's why he says the world is bigger than five, so that those outside the five at the at the UN Security Council will feel that they're part of this process. They own the process. They are not excluded. They are not harassed. They are not threatened by the big powers. I think it serves everybody's interest to treat all key players here equally and fairly so that we can create really a global order or assembling of it that will serve everyone's security interests.
So picking up where you talked about the president's two chemistry and personal relationships, it seems if it was just left to these two individual statesmen, we might be in a different place. But because of the dynamics of not just domestic politics, not just global politics, but what they have to deal with in their own populations, that's one of the kind of curses or benefits of democracy in some ways. Yeah. How do we build on that success? It seems that while Turkey may not have elections for the next 4 years, we're very aware of elections coming very soon here in 2020. We're all very following the different candidates. Clearly, President Trump is very focused on those areas. When I listened at the NATO summit, President Trump didn't come to it. It was Vice President Pence, and he had some very harsh words, not just for Germany, but Turkey as well. And so in an environment in which there's an entire administration, there's entire ministries that have long and deep-seated relationships. We see Ambassador Jeffries, others that are here that are affirming the importance of the relationship. How do you get past the noise, the headlines, to kind of go back to the basics of this relationship, and how do we get back to business?
I think we should set our priorities right, work out the issues that we have. So let me just briefly address those few issues that General Akar also mentioned, because what I see most of the time is that some of our friends here in the Washington circles maybe do not understand how serious these threats are for Turkey. And when they see the end result as a reaction, they kind of say, well, where did this come from? So just a little bit background to that. We have two main issues in the relationship between Turkey and the United States at the moment. One is the continuing U.S. support for PYD, YPG in Syria. We have raised this issue many, many times. We know all the details, but just to put on the record, it's extremely important for our friends here in Washington to understand why Turkey takes this issue so seriously. Every support that is given to PYD, YPG in Syria in the name of fight against Daesh ends up to be a support, directly or indirectly, for the PKK. At that time, when we are giving a very strong and largely successful fight against the PKK on the Turkish territories. Look at the area. The only breathing space PKK has at the moment is northern Syria and parts of Iraq. We are putting a lot of pressure on Iraq. We're working with our allies and of course with the Iraqi government to make sure that Iraq doesn't become a launching pad for terrorist attacks against Turkey. But how about northern Syria?
most of the PKK operatives, members, fighters, terrorists, in fact, are being trained in northern Syria. Had it not been for our president's intervention, probably PKK has already turned or will have turned northern Syria into some kind of a PKK state structure already. So we had to take those actions, obviously, against the PYD, YPG, because we cannot let that kind of a terror corridor establish right along our border. This not only goes against our own national security, but also goes against the idea of Syria's territorial integrity and political unity. Because if you make that exception for one ethnic group or one particular group in Syria, you end up dividing Syria totally. Then the Arabs will demand similar things, the Alawites will demand similar things, Christians, Turkoman, and many others. That will go against the whole idea of keeping Syria together. So that's number one. Number two, the issue of veto. Again, it was raised by General Akar. But again, I want to underline how important this issue is for Turkey. This terrorist carried out a military coup in Turkey, killing 251 people in one day and injuring more than 1,000 people. They've tried everything in Turkey to take over, and now they're using all of their resources to poison U.S.-Turkish relations. Even as we speak now, I'm sure they're following, they're watching, and they're tweeting, they're writing, and they're doing all kinds of things to poison U.S.-Turkish relations. Why should we allow them to do that? We don't need these people. You don't need these people. Why should they be a problem, a burden for relations between Turkey and the United States? We presented overwhelming evidence for their crimes in Turkey, as well as their criminal acts here in the United States. But unfortunately, neither the Obama administration nor the Trump administration has taken any concrete steps that will satisfy Turkey's demands or concerns about this issue. Then there are some other minor issues, like Halkbank and a few other issues that you are all aware of. Unfortunately, we have not seen much progress on any of these issues. Yes, we need to talk, we need to address these issues, there's no doubt about it, but to have a positive agenda in a real sense of the term, we really have to get these issues out of the way. Manbij roadmap, again, that was agreed upon months ago, and it's taken forever to make any progress there. So that creates a sense of frustration in Ankara. I think that should be understood clearly. Now, having said all this, still, our president believes in having a good, strong, productive relationship with the United States. That's why, he values his relationship, personal friendship with President Trump, to address all these issues. I think for other decision makers and movers and shakers in the Washington circles and in the U.S. in general, including the business people here, I think we should see the larger picture here where the Turkish-U.S. relationship fits. I don't think the United States can afford to lose Turkey as a friend and ally. I know there are circles and groups and interest groups and others that kind of advocate this kind of thing, but those who really know the statesmanship and the significance of U.S.-Turkish relations, they will, I think, admit that U.S. cannot afford to lose Turkey as a friend. And we do not want to have any conflict with the United States, but I think we need to address those specific issues to move forward with an agenda, again, that will be positive, substantive, productive for all sides.
When I look out into the room and see so many faces that have been around for a while and focused on the friendship and the importance of this relationship, it's become increasingly harder in this town to speak up because even those who are friends of Turkey find that there's not much positive space because of people focusing on domestic or security or political areas. They focus on the differences, the things that divide us, rather than what brings us together. We all go back to history. We all go back to the security relationship. We go to the bedrock of the relationship. What gives you cause for optimism in the future? We know what's there in the past. How do we connect or bridge between the past and the future that would allow us to get back to the point of back to business that this conference is about?
Well, U.S.-Turkish relationship is based on a long tradition of seeking not only good bilateral relations, but also a perspective on regional and global issues. It has had its own ups and downs in its long history, and there's no doubt about that. We have had good days, we've had bad days. And I think it's only natural, I guess, you know, between any two countries, even allies. But now, given all the chaos and the sense of despair, hopelessness in the global order, I think we need a relationship based on positive values more than ever. And that should be the guiding principle in our thinking, not the short-term political agenda whereby, you know, some people may make a few points domestically, etc., but rather, you know, focus on the long-term perspective. We need partnership, we need friendship to address issues of terrorism, regional disorder, including the situation in Iraq, Syria, the Palestinian conflict, situation in Africa, in Yemen, and many other areas. For trade relations, again, as I mentioned, President Trump has rightly set a new target for $75 billion trade volume. That's wonderful. But how are we going to achieve that if we keep having these political issues getting in the way? And if we have the Congress, for example, threatening Turkey with sanctions, how are we going to achieve that goal? I think that gives us a duty to work on these issues so that we not only achieve those goals of $75 billion trade volume and, you know, trying to resolve the Syrian conflict and other issues, but also have partnership in other areas like education, technology, and many other areas. Speaking of technology, for example, again, we come back to this issue. We've been friends and allies for many decades, but when it comes to sharing critical technology infrastructure, unfortunately, we have not seen enough determination or support from the U.S. side. The whole Patriot issue and the S-400 issue, in fact, came about as a result of this issue. When the proposal was made for the Patriot, for example, Patriots, one of our demands and key priorities was to have transfer of technology, co-production, because we want to learn this technology. We are now much more advanced in defense industry. We are producing a number of products in the defense industry area with global standards, and we want to develop this technology. But unfortunately, we have been refused many times. So you start looking for other alternatives. So in the long run, obviously, friendship requires that, you know, we share this technology and industrial productions and co-production, etc. That was one of the main reasons why Turkey went for S-400. Of course, it's still you know, a process there. But I think in all of these areas, we can still have more partnership and set an example and have a success story. And I believe it is doable. It's not that impossible. We just have to see things within a larger strategic framework.
So taking that larger strategic framework in it, we put the charge that we've been given by both our presidents of $75 billion, which actually in the grand scheme of things is not very large, but in the context of U.S. Turkey is huge. What do we need to get there? I mean, one of the things that allowed the security relationship to flourish and allowed the second largest military, NATO, to work hand in hand is because of the personal relationships of many of the people sitting in this room, a lot of the generals and the people that invested in those personal relationships. How do you create that same sense of ownership, responsibility, and pass it on to the next generation when many folks continue to say, well, the world is more and more dangerous, I'd rather be isolated. Whether that's in Turkey where the only thing that they see in the headlines is anti-American and everything they see is America's against us and there's a conspiracy against Turkey to keep us down, or on the American side saying everything that involves Turkey must be bad because all we can see is one individual who represents the will of 82 million people. How do you get beyond that and what do we need to get there? Is it a free trade deal? Is it business leaders speaking out more forcefully? Is it more conferences like this? What is it concretely that gets us to that next place?
I believe Turkey has a lot of friends here in Washington, in the U.S. in general. Obviously, they should speak up more loudly to address these issues. You said it's a difficult thing to be a friend of Turkey these days. That's precisely all the more reason why we need people, our own friends, our true friends, to speak up more loudly to address these issues. Turkey is a big country. Turkey is a vibrant democracy. Our president has not only improved Turkish economy, but its security and has opened up Turkey to different parts of the world. That should be welcome by everyone at a time of this age of globalization, where everything has become intertwined, where you cannot just have one narrow focus on foreign policy, but you have to really see things from a 360-degree perspective. That should be welcome, rather than seen as, oh, Turkey is moving away from the West, from its traditional Western alliance, etc. To the contrary, it actually strengthens Turkey's position if it is seen as an opportunity. For example, Turkey's engagement in Iraq, in Syria, in the Palestinian issue, in Africa, in other places, could be seen as an asset for dealing with a number of specific issues. Now, coming back to your question about how do we move forward, as I said, we really have to address the issue of trust that has come out of these issues not being addressed. I mentioned the PYD, YPG issue, the Syria, FETA, and a number of other issues. Now, on top of that, when you have S-400, F-35, and CATSA and things like that, that becomes obviously more difficult. So we really have to address these issues in the long-term interest of the relationship, while at the same time working on other areas, as I said, education, technology, trade, and other areas. We share a lot. We can do much more. Turkey has a lot to give to the United States, and the United States has a lot to give to Turkey, and the business communities can make it happen.
So let me ask you one more question in that vein, and then I want to get personal, just to give you a warning. In that vein of kind of figuring out how to bring us together, what united us during the Cold War was a common enemy. We don't seem to share that anymore. We have differences of opinion about who represents certain groups as terrorists, who represents others as friends or allies. We're having a difference of kind of optics in terms of where we're sitting is now determining where we're standing on different things. So if it's not a common enemy, if it's not China or Russia or any other major competitor to the US, what is it that creates that shared values again? Because right now, from the outside, it seems very much like we're back to an age of kind of imperial powers. It looks much more like a world of transactionalism and interest and short-termism than long-term vision. How do we get back there, even with leaders and statesmen that get along personally?
You raise an important issue about the state of the world at the moment. One, I think, important principle to keep in mind is the fact that nobody is safe until everybody is safe in this world. If you define safety in terms of your narrow national priority, in fact, you fail at securing a reasonable concept of safety and security for your own nation, country, region. Therefore, it's important to address issues in Syria, in Iraq, or in Palestine, and other areas. So that requires partnership. Unilateralism will not solve our problems. Multilateralism has worked in many areas, and we need it actually more than ever. We understand, again, putting your national interest as a priority, that's understandable, but if you do it at the expense of others and create a sense of loneliness or discrimination or alienation, among many other partners, that actually ends up creating problems for your own national interest and security. So we have to see this within this larger context. If we want a world based on peace, justice for all, not just for a certain group of countries, but for all, big and small, rich and poor, Eastern and Western, Northern and Southern, doesn't matter, then we really have to redefine our key concepts and notions and understand that every nation, every country is entitled to freedom, peace, prosperity, and stability. And that can be achieved for all if we have a proper perspective and not define security, peace, and prosperity at the expense of others. And I think we can achieve that. Our president has been raising this issue as a global principle for peace and security for all. That's why he raises his voice over the Palestinian issue, over Africa, over many other issues. That should not be seen as anti-Americanism or anti-Westernism in any sense. We are addressing specific political issues, and I think we need to address these issues. I think it's in the interest of United States and European countries also to pay attention to the sense of consternation, sense of alienation that comes, from some of those policies. In the long run, again, I think it is possible to have a common perspective on bilateral relations as well as global issues that will address the security concerns of all partners together.
I promise to end on a personal note. You got your PhD here in Washington. You have a long relationship here. You've worked at Georgetown. You've been coming back and forth for your entire career. I got my start in Turkey doing a Fulbright in Turkey right when your government came to power. It's been a long time watching these developments. How do you keep yourself motivated in the face of such difficult kind of headwinds? And then what single piece of advice would you have for everyone in this room that wants to walk out of here and can do one thing to kind of improve that relationship that we all believe in?
Let me address the first part of your question in a rather philosophical way, which is the domain I like, but I know this is not the setting for it. So I don't want to get you lost in the world of philosophical notions and ideas. But I think what I really like about, and what I see as a shared point between the American people and the Turkish people, is their open horizon outlook on things. That is, the possibilities are there. We can go and grab them. We can create a new world. That's how American society, in fact, was established in the first place. When the Pilgrims left Europe behind, and they left a Europe behind that had its own problems, politically, socially, economically, and many other areas, and they came to this country to establish a new world. That's why it was called the New World, and they did something remarkable here. So they have, from the very beginning, I think American people have had this kind of open horizon perspective on things. People in Turkey, Turkish people, also have this perspective, especially now with the new leadership, where yes, we want to have good relations with all the countries, with different cultures, without any prejudice against their cultural traditions or religious identities, because Turkey is also very multicultural, multi-religious in many respects. And we can bring these horizons together. As the German philosopher Gadamer has said, we can have a fusion of horizons, where my horizon gets fused up with yours, and that creates a new synergy, a new perspective that presents new possibilities and opportunities. I believe we can achieve that. What motivates me is the possibility that we have overcome many difficult political issues in the past. We can overcome them today. But more importantly, we really need to have this relationship function in a way that will not only address our security concerns, national security concerns, but also set an example for others, for NATO, for European countries, for African nations, for Southeast Asia. I do believe that we can achieve these goals together, and of course it requires a lot of work. It requires statesmanship rather than brinkmanship. It requires commitment to our core values and principles, and we all want to leave a legacy that will be remembered as one that has taken these values at heart and made the world a better place for everyone.
I think that's a perfect place to end. If you'll join me in thanking Dr. Kalın for his time, and thank you for setting the scene for us.